Arranged marriage. Copyright 2015 by Samantha Price. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Be strong and of a good courage, fear not, nor be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 6. The year is 1763. Miriam chants. Stop daydreaming and finish your soup. The sharp tone of her mother's voice snapped her back to the present moment. She looked down at her soup amidst the snickering of Hazel and Moira, her two younger sisters. At 14 and 16, both took delight in seeing her corrected. Yeah, Mom. Sorry, Miriam replied with the utmost sincerity. Oh, let her be, Mom. Miriam looked across the ship's small table at her older brother James. He continued, she's just wondering what it will be like to see Adam Stutzman again. No, you've got it wrong, James. She's wondering what it will be like to marry Adam Stutzman, came Matthew's reply. Matthew was the brother nearest to her in age, and he often took to teaming up with their younger sisters to torment her. Hazel and Moira laughed out loud at Matthew's suggestion. Miriam smiled, knowing that if she showed the slightest amount of annoyance it would please her sisters enormously. She wouldn't allow them the satisfaction of seeing that happen. Adam. What would it be like to see him again? The mention of his name put a lump in her throat, making it difficult to swallow even a spoonful of the tasteless thin liquid her mother had made. The ship had provided each family with food that they were responsible for cooking. Now Miriam's family's ration of food was severely low. In an effort to make the food last longer, Mrs. Shantz took to making soup. Miriam coughed, then fumbled to cover her mouth with a napkin. May I be excused, Mom? I'm feeling too tired for dinner tonight. She rose, hoping for a positive response. Her mother nodded and gave a wave of her hand. I wish you all a good night, Miriam said to her family. Miriam untied her bonnet, and then threw it on one of the two beds that her family of 7 had to share. She pulled a brush through her long brown hair. She'd always disliked her hair color and her dark eyes, as well as being the odd one out in the family of blue-eyed blondes. She would have been happier if her eyes had been blue, since she considered blue eyes the prettiest color of all. When she was younger, her mother had reprimanded her for wishing to look different than she did. It is not the outer beauty that counts, she was told, it is the inner beauty that God is concerned with. She was soon to discover that talk of looks or beauty was prideful, and Miriam had quickly learned not to speak of personal appearance, not hers or anyone else's. Later that evening, tucked in tightly between her two sisters on one narrow bed, she listened to the crash of waves and tried to allow the constant movement of the ship to comfort her. She was grateful that the sea was now calm after enduring 3 days of storms, but still she could not hold back her tears. There had been so many changes in their lives these past years. There had been failed crops, little money, and mounting disagreeable politics in their region. There were harsh rules forbidding them to worship God in the way that they wished. America would give them freedom to worship God however they chose. They were heading to a new country, with the promise of a prosperous life. The Stutzmans had said they'd made a good fortune, and with more hands to do more work, the families could enjoy the increase together. The only time she'd seen her parents smile was when they read the Stutzmans' letters. If what they had described in their letters were true, her family members' lives would be so much better. The logical thing for the family to do was to join their friends in America. Maybe the Stutzmans had traveled on this very same ship, she mused. It was difficult to recall her impressions of Adam Stutzman, since he was so much older than Miriam. When she was young, she did not think about boys or men in the way that she did now. Miriam's parents had informed her that they had agreed with Mr. and Mrs. Stutzman's request that she marry their eldest son. In her heart, Miriam knew her hand in marriage had been given in exchange for their fare to the new country. It was also clear from what her parents had said that Adam had not requested it himself. The request had come from his parents. She closed her eyes tightly and pictured Adam as she'd known him. Years ago he had jokingly called her his girl, and now she was to be his girl for real. She remembered that his hair was dark and he was always smiling, joking around. If truth were told, she'd always had a little crush on him way back then. However, people change, so she wondered how would she know if he was still the same person he had been now that he was older. She told her parents no, she would not agree to a marriage until she saw him again. Her mother had pleaded with her to go along with their decision. Miriam considered that her mother wanted security for her children, since they'd only known hunger and an uncertain future. It was only natural for her mother to want something better for all of them. Miriam had relented and agreed to marriage with Adam, hoping that he was still the happy boy that she'd had that secret crush on. Still with closed eyes, she recalled conversations she'd had about marriage to Adam. Miriam had teased her mother and father about him. "I don't remember Adam, Mom. Which one of the Stutzman boys is he?" "He's the eldest, Miriam," her father had said. "He's about 10 years older than you, 28 now, I would guess. Such a smart young man, hard-working, and he's a believer." He'd stared at Miriam. "Don't look so worried, everything will be good." "I'll be the judge of that," she'd thought. Miriam's time on the cramped ship had been both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, she'd had plenty of time to get used to the idea that she would never see Switzerland again. On the other hand, the endless days of cramped dark quarters, illness, and dining on simple rations caused a monotony that one had to experience in order to comprehend. What would the new country be like? What would it be like to see the Stutzman family again? Would she long for the only home she'd ever known, or would she be enamored with the wild, untamed beauty of America of which the Stutzmans had written them? Simple things were enough to send her imagination spinning into a stream of thoughts filled with what-ifs and what-nexts. Miriam desperately tried to recall more images of Adam. She only had a handful of memories. Had she known she was destined to marry him, she would have gathered more. It matters not, I guess. I don't recall any of the Stutzman boys ever being horrible, so I guess he'll be just fine. As land finally came into view, Miriam was sure it was the happiest day of her life. She silently vowed that nothing could ever make her board a ship again. Cheers sounded as passengers celebrated the fact that they'd arrived in the port of Philadelphia, and their long journey had come to an end. Someone had told her that the ocean crossing had taken 18 weeks. To Miriam it seemed as though it had taken years to get there. Surrounded by her parents, 2 older brothers, and 2 younger sisters, Miriam stood on the ship's deck watching the land of their new home draw closer. The air she breathed was warm and inviting, unlike the chilling air that had filled her lungs when she'd left Switzerland, her home for the past 18 years. She drummed her fingers on the ship's railing, grateful for an outlet for the fluttering of anxiety that clenched her chest. That morning her family had packed, and was more than ready to step onto dry land. After a few more hours, after the ship came to a halt in the port, but then they had to wait on board to be declared free of diseases. It was 2 full days later that the Shantz family finally joined a line of passengers leaving the ship. Miriam put on a sunny smile, and with her worldly belongings tucked under her arm, stepped onto the dock. The sun shone brightly, and it was a perfect day for her feet to step onto solid ground. They weren't prepared for the many more hours' wait they faced. They sat and waited, while those passengers in front were asked many questions and had their papers examined. Some passengers were held and some were allowed through. There were whispers that some of the passengers would be sent home. Wasn't this the promised land, the land of opportunity? The Stutzmans had spoken as if America would be welcoming, but it seemed to Miriam they were reluctant to allow people in. Her parents were asked many questions and their papers were examined too. Her father had to sign an oath of allegiance on behalf of his family, and then they were officially approved, were among the lucky ones who were allowed into the country. Once they walked clear of the port, Hazel asked, "Where do we go now, Dad?" Moira pulled on her father's coat. "How far to the Stutzman's house, Dad?" Her father didn't answer, his eyes fixed on a tall young man making quick strides toward them. "Are you the Shantz family?" the young man asked when he stopped in front of Mr. Shantz. Mr. Shantz eyed the young fellow some more and then said, "That's us." Chapter 2. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 31. Miriam watched as her father and brothers greeted the man who had walked toward them as if he had known them. It had been arranged for them to travel by covered wagon to the Stutzman's house. At first Miriam hoped the young man might be Adam. Wouldn't Adam be anxious to see her since she was the woman he was to marry? The attractive young man smiled warmly and shook each of their hands in turn, tipping his hat to her mother before turning his attention to Miriam and her sisters. He'd introduced himself as Stephen Williams, a member of their community, a fellow believer and a friend of the Stutzmans. "I trust your travels were pleasant, Mrs. Shantz?" the tall, fair-haired man asked her mother. "Well, we are weary from the ship, but tell me, how long will it take for us to get to Earl Town?" Stephen shrugged his shoulders. "It's around 80 miles, but it'll take around 9, maybe 10 days. Seeing the look on their faces, he explained, "There are no roads and the horses need rest. They can't travel day and night, nor can we travel in a straight line." "Weeks?" Hazel shrieked. "I thought we'd be there tonight." Her father patted her shoulder. He said 10 days at the most, that's not weeks. "Have patience, Hazel. We're very close, we're off the ship." "The time will pass quickly," Mrs. Shantz said, looking like she'd like nothing more than her own bed and a good night's sleep. Miriam watched Stephen. The twinkle in his eyes caught her attention. After Stephen had spoken to her mother and her father, he helped them pack their belongings into the wagon. Once they were seated inside the wagon, Stephen clicked the horses forward. At last Miriam felt she could relax. They were nearly at their new home. It didn't matter to Miriam how far the Stutzman's house was. She was off the ship and on dry land. The road was dusty, bumpy, and the wind was threatening to whip Miriam's bonnet right off her head. She was seated the closest to the back of the wagon. Her mother urged her to move further inside, but she was enamored with her first glimpses of America, a country that had only lived in her imagination up to that point. Miles of open field surrounded her as the wagon weaved its way through small clumps of trees, around hills and then through the open land. In the distance, wispy grasses waved gently, and every now and again a clump of wildflowers livened the landscape with a splash of color. The next days were filled with more of the same. The days were hot, but the nights were cold. At night they sat around a glowing campfire and ate the real food that Stephen had brought with him. He'd brought fresh vegetables, which they hadn't eaten in months. Miriam's 2 older brothers took to sitting next to Stephen as he drove, asking him questions about the country and about the people in the town where they were headed. "How do you know where you're going if there are no roads?" Miriam asked Stephen one day when she sat up front with him. "I've been this way before more than once. I fetched 2 other families from the port, so I just know the landmarks to watch for, and I know the position where the sun needs to be if I'm going the right way." Stephen was warm and friendly, and Miriam wondered if this man was married or had a girlfriend. The days wore on endlessly, but then their journey was over and she was looking at her new home. Mr. and Mrs. Stutzman ran to greet them, warmly extending arms for embraces and handshakes. There were howls as the 2 mothers cried, falling into each other's arms. Clearly there was a bond between these 2 women, a friendship that they'd sorely missed. "It's wonderful to see you all. We're so glad you finally arrived. Come, let's get you settled. You must be exhausted." Mrs. Stutzman bustled and buzzed around, trying her best to make every single one of them feel welcome and at home. Stephen sought out Miriam to say goodbye. "I'll be seeing you around, I hope. Apart from the gatherings when the bishop's here?" "How often does the bishop visit?" "About once a month. He travels around to the different towns." "Where do you live?" Miriam asked. "Close by, and my parents own the general store." Miriam smiled. She was glad that she'd see him soon. She watched as his wagon disappeared from view. Over biscuits, strawberry jam and tea in the Stutzman's kitchen, Miriam learned that a temporary home, a small homestead, had been erected not far from the Stutzman's house. It was just 3 bedrooms with an outhouse in the field behind it. Her whole family would share this space until they could build a bigger home. Miriam had been hoping to have her own room, but she knew she still might when they built their new home. They were to stay right there in the Stutzman's home for the next night or 2, until the final touches were made to the 3-bedroom homestead. "You'll be a bit crowded for a while," Mr. Stutzman said. "Don't worry though. There's so much work to be done outside and around this place, you won't be in the house long enough to feel crowded. When you head home after a long day of working in the fields, you'll be bone tired, so sharing elbow space with your kinfolk won't bother you at all." After an hour or so of exchanging pleasantries and news, Mrs. Stutzman showed everyone exactly where they would be sleeping for the next few nights. Miriam kept an eye out for anything resembling a wash basin, desperate for a chance to wash and feel clean again after the long, dusty wagon drive. So far she'd seen nothing of the kind. She considered it strange that none of the Stutzman boys had joined her family in the kitchen for refreshments. She wondered where they were. She had expected a warmer reception from the 5 boys who would soon be her family by marriage. And then her question was answered by the loud clanging of a dinner bell being rung by Mr. Stutzman. "The boys are out in the fields, folks. This will bring them home," he said. Miriam wondered how the bell could be heard across the expanse of fields that surrounded them. As far as her eyes could see, there were rows and rows of crops stretching on for what looked like miles. But sure enough, soon she heard the thunder of hooves and saw a long wagon heading to the house. She watched as they came closer, her eyes scanning their faces for the friendly face of her intended, but she didn't see him, and yet none of the 5 young men seemed like strangers. As she made out each of their features, her memory of younger versions of these same men came back to her in a rush. Every last one of them was sun-kissed and bright-eyed, and they all looked tall. One man was on a horse, and the other 4 were in the wagon. As the man dismounted his horse, and the other men jumped down from the wagon, Mr. Stutzman handled introductions. "From youngest to oldest, we have Samuel, Robert, Jacob, Evan, and Adam." His hand swept across the lineup of fine young men as he spoke. Miriam looked directly at Adam, and he smiled back at her with a flash of white teeth. She considered that he was the most handsome of his brothers. From beneath his hat she watched his eyes drift to her sister's. "So this is my wife-to-be, is it?" he asked, stepping forward and looking at Hazel, the 16-year-old. Hazel's blonde head whipped in Adam's direction when she realized he was speaking about her. "No, Adam," Mrs. Stutzman said. "This here is your betrothed, Miriam." Mrs. Stutzman put her hands gently on Miriam's shoulders as she spoke. "Oh, too bad. I always preferred blondes," Adam said as he stepped forward to shake Miriam's hand. Adam's younger brothers stifled laughter at his words. Miriam looked up into his face, 2 heads above her own, and wondered why he'd been so rude. "I always preferred blondes." "Is that any way to reacquaint yourself with the woman you are to marry?" she wondered. Surely he remembered, "I have brown hair." Still, she congenially took his hand and shook it. "It's good to see you again, Adam. Thank you for leaving your work and coming to greet us." "I had to, it was dinner time," he answered in a serious manner, but his 4 brothers chuckled at his words. Miriam glanced at her mother, and their eyes met. Her mother hastily cast her gaze elsewhere. "Ha! She's no happier with his words than I am. No, I quite understand. You could never miss anything important as dinner when you've been working so hard," Miriam said. Thanks to her sisters, she was used to ignoring people's jibes and unpleasant remarks. She found that their remarks stopped when people saw that it didn't bother her. She would play that game around Adam if she had to. Now that she'd seen him, she wasn't impressed. Sure, he was handsome, but she would have preferred a plainer man who adored her rather than a man who preferred the look of her sister. That night, Miriam was grateful that dinner buzzed with conversation. No one noticed that she didn't speak once during the meal. She was glad to help with the cleanup afterward, giving herself more reason not to speak to the Stutzman boys. "Are you glad to be here, Miriam?" Miriam looked over at Mrs. Stutzman, who was scraping the leftovers from the plates. "Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. I couldn't wait to get off the ship and get onto solid ground. Somehow, I still feel as though I'm on the ship and the ground is moving." Miriam gave a little giggle. "You looked a little sad over dinner," Mrs. Stutzman said, clearly not buying her cheerful exterior. At that moment, Miriam's mother walked into the kitchen carrying the serving dishes. "Don't mind Miriam, she's a daydreamer. She's always off in the clouds thinking about something or other. She's never sad though, not my Miriam." Mrs. Stutzman gave Miriam a big smile. "Glad to hear it." The next 2 days were spent under the Stutzman's roof. The boys were gone early and didn't come back until late. It was only dinner at night that Miriam had to be concerned with. She wasn't comfortable with Adam the way he'd spoken to her, and neither was she comfortable with his brothers the way they had snickered. Mrs. Stutzman had kept the Shantz women busy with quilting. She made quilts for the less fortunate, and was pleased to have female companionship after being alone for so long with no womenfolk nearby. There was nothing that Hazel and Moira liked more than sewing, whereas Miriam preferred to cook. Her 2 brothers had taken to following the older Stutzman boys around, going to work with them in the fields. Chapter 3. And now abide faith, hope, charity, these 3, but the greatest of these is charity. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 13. At last their temporary home was livable. In time, her father would build a fine house for them to live in just like the one they'd had in Switzerland. While the men did most of the work, the girls had their personal belongings to unpack. As Miriam carried her belongings to the house, she tripped on a tree root and spilled the contents of her satchel all over the ground. Adam deftly stepped over her treasured notebook. "Won't be needing that here, miss. Too much work to do. Best start using those pages for something more useful, like for the fire. Or maybe paper for the outhouse." He smiled, tipping his hat as he strode toward her family's little homestead with a trunk balanced skillfully on his shoulder. Miriam was puzzled. Did he really mean to be so ugly to her, or was he just shy and maybe this was how he coped? Or is he no more excited about our betrothal than I am, and this is how he's choosing to let me know? She straightened her bonnet, picked up her things, and caught up to him. "Do you try to be mean to me?" He laughed, but not in a kind or friendly way, and no more was said by either of them. As the days wore on and the two families settled into a routine, the verbal sparring between Miriam and Adam didn't abate. Unfortunately, her parents didn't seem to notice, though she hoped they would. How could they expect her to marry this man who constantly picked on her and went out of his way to be objectionable? To make the situation worse, the two sets of parents would find little ways of leaving Adam and Miriam alone together. Today, it had been arranged that Adam should help Miriam gather water from the stream for the laundry. He walked with her while she carried the water to where she would do the laundry. Not once did he offer to help. Then Adam left to join his brothers in the field. Miriam was glad when her mother joined her to help. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Miriam scrubbed the family's clothes clean against a washboard perched in the wooden pail. "What is it, Miriam?" "I was wondering, do you think that Adam hates me?" "Hate? Oh, that's a strong word, dear girl. How could you possibly think he hates you? He just makes everything difficult for me, like he's trying to on purpose. He teases me constantly. He asks me if I think I might turn into a blonde someday, which is a ridiculous notion, and he seems intent on proving to me just how hard this life is. I don't know, he seems to despise me and I don't know why." Her mother was silent for a few moments, and seemed to wrestle with what advice to give her daughter. Finally she spoke. "Being betrothed to someone you hardly know isn't easy for either person. The fact is that neither of you have a choice about it. He's 28 and it's time he took a wife. There aren't any women around here for miles, just you. You don't have a choice either. We need to keep our relationship with the Stutzmans healthy, we're indebted. Of course we'll pay them back every dime for the passage here, but it will take some time." Miriam had been right. The Stutzmans had paid their fare so Adam would have a wife. It wasn't just goodwill or friendship that had prompted them to perform the gesture. Maybe it was an implied agreement, since her mother had mentioned paying them back. If she'd been bought for their fare over here, surely her parents would be free of their debt to the Stutzmans. The workings of the world were still a mysterious thing to Miriam, even though she was 18. Her mother continued, "He's the perfect choice. He knows our family and knows our ways. He comes from the same town as you, and that's a strong foundation for a marriage. We're not going to force you to marry, but surely you can see that a marriage between you and Adam makes perfect sense?" Her mother had asked in such a way that there was only one way that Miriam could respond. "Yes, it makes perfect sense to everyone else, I guess. I hope that in time, the two of you will get to know each other better and come to appreciate each other." Miriam removed her hands from the water. They had become chapped from the wind, the cold water and the soap, and she couldn't have felt more unattractive. She'd tried so hard to engage Adam in conversation, get to know him better, at least become his friend, but nothing had worked. And now she knew she was not going to get any sympathy from her mother. She'd always tried to be positive, to create her own happiness, and she'd always trusted in God through all their hard times. But in that moment, her optimism reached an all-time low. She missed the foggy lushness of Switzerland, the familiarity of her home there. America might have been the land of opportunity, but it was also the land of hard work, and hard work for everyone. The way the Stutzmans had spoken of America, she had expected an easier life, for her family to be wealthy and to not have to work as hard as they did. Miriam was disappointed in her new surroundings. She still had to work hard every day of her life, and now she had to marry a man she didn't particularly like. All around her there was work and few comforts. No bathtub to soak in after a long day, no hot water unless she heated it first herself over a fire, no privacy in the home she shared with her family, and no friends as she had back home. Her heart broke in that moment, and she left behind her laundry bucket and ran to the homestead with tears streaming down her face. She got down on her knees and said a fervent prayer that her parents would see what they were forcing her into, and call off the wedding between Adam and herself. She and Adam obviously would never fall in love. Finding love between such different people seemed a complete impossibility. Her only hope was that her parents would notice how miserable he made her. She prayed like she'd never prayed before. Chapter 4. For we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope, for what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? Romans chapter 8 verse 24. Adam's ribbing didn't stop. His gruff words and sarcastic remarks were a regular part of her day, and Miriam fell into survival mode, trying to stay out of his way as much as she could. Whenever they started to speak as two normal people would speak to each other, it usually turned into a heated argument. They were so different that Miriam wondered why her parents weren't able to see it. When Miriam's father said he had some errands to run in town, a half-hour wagon ride from their homestead, Miriam jumped at the chance to accompany him and get off the farm for the day. She hoped she might see the kind and cheerful Stephen Williams. On the way to town, the sun was shining, and she embraced a happiness she hadn't known in a long while simply by being miles from Adam. Her heart was happy, and she found herself smiling like a fool just because she could, without Adam teasing her for it. In fact, she was smiling as they rode through a rainstorm. The rain had stopped when they arrived in town, but the road was still muddy. They had to trudge through the town in damp clothes with their shoes covered in mud. They found the small store that sold everything from clothing to flour and sugar. It was constrained and tiny, nothing like she had expected. She thought she had come to a wealthy country, but from what she'd seen so far, there was nothing that impressed her. Remembering that she was far away from Adam, though, her lips turned upward at the corners once more. Her father left her at the store while he went to the post office. She mentally reviewed the list of items she needed to find in this strange little store. It was while she was stooped over a shelf, looking through the burlap sacks for one that said beans, that she sensed she was being watched. She stood tall quickly and turned. Looking straight at her was the smiling face of a tall, handsome man. He was grinning at her, and his green eyes sparkled like a mischievous cat. He tipped his hat in greeting. "Good day, sir," she said. "I believe we've met already. Do you remember?" "I could never forget it," he said softly, still smiling. Miriam lowered her eyes demurely, flattered by his kind words. "I didn't see you again after the day you brought us to the Stutzman's house. At first I thought you lived to the east of the Stutzman's farm, but I walked that one day and—" "Been looking for me, were you?" His grin lit up the room, causing her heart to beat a little faster. "Maybe," she said, enjoying the fact that the man seemed attracted to her. "I live to the north of their farm. I help out sometimes on the Stutzman's farm just when they need me." He held out his two hands in demonstration, and she couldn't help but notice how tan and strong they were. Standing in the small aisle covered in mud and dust from the road and looking completely windblown, Miriam forgot her list entirely. He reminded her his name was Stephen, told her that he lived past the Stutzman farm another half hour, that he'd been born in America, and he'd never traveled farther than 100-mile radius of his family's home. Then she told him about Switzerland and all the things she missed while he leaned against a top shelf and listened intently. At the end of their conversation, he made funny remarks about her words and her accent, which made her giggle. "Are you going to buy those beans or just hold them all day?" A sharp-toned voice came from behind the counter. The shopkeeper was obviously tired of watching Miriam linger in her store. "That's my mother," Stephen whispered. Miriam raised her eyebrows. "Yes, I remember you saying your family owned this store," she whispered back. "I also work here. She's angry with me for talking rather than working. Come along, I'll introduce you." Miriam was pleased to see Mrs. Williams smile while they were being introduced. She didn't seem nearly as frightening when she smiled. When pleasantries were exchanged, Miriam found the remaining items she needed with Stephen's help. He helped her load the goods into Mr. Shantz's wagon, which was directly outside the store. "Miss Miriam, can I call on you maybe this Sunday?" Miriam cringed. She'd been enjoying Stephen's company so much that she had completely forgotten about Adam. It almost seemed like Adam no longer existed, and yet he did. She couldn't be dishonest and allow Stephen to think she was unattached. "Stephen, it's just that. It's Adam Stutzman, isn't it? He's the reason you're hesitating?" How did you know about Adam? Nothing's a secret around these parts. Everyone knows everything about everyone. I knew you were coming on the ship, and had been promised to Adam. I'm glad I was the one to greet your family at the port. I knew nothing about you then, but I was pretty sure any woman in her right mind would have turned right back around and sailed back to Switzerland if Adam were the first person she'd met at the dock. The moment I saw you. What? Miriam asked. Her heart pounded so hard in her chest that she wondered if she were harming her good health. I knew you weren't for him, he said. For Adam. Miriam exhaled softly, willing her heart to be calm. And then her father was there beside her, shaking Stephen's hand and asking how he'd been. In a matter of moments, she was in the wagon with her father on their way back home. Miriam's heart sank at the thought of Adam, and then soared when images of Stephen came into her mind, his kindness, his strong hands, the way his green eyes twinkled when he looked at her, the way he made her feel special. She sighed. What's that? Did you say something? Her father asked. No, nothing. It's just the heat, she said. You know Stephen? Yes, he drove us to the Stutzmans from the port. We spent days with him in the wagon. Her father frowned at her. That's right. Her head was in a muddle. Miriam looked down, glad that her father was now looking back at the road ahead and wouldn't see her flushed cheeks. Half an hour flew by way too fast, and they were home before she knew it. Unexpectedly, Adam greeted them at their homestead, and tended to the horses and wagon that they'd traveled in. Adam often showed up at their homestead unannounced, then he'd make himself useful and ask if there were any work to be done. There was always plenty of work tending to the pigs and chickens the Stutzmans had given them. Then there was the vegetable garden to tend. Her parents always gave him chores, and Miriam knew it was to keep him close to her. The following week went by, filled with long days of work around the homestead. Miriam's only bright spot was in the moments she allowed herself to recall all Stephen had said, how he had looked and how she'd felt around him. As Sunday morning rolled around, she looked forward to a day of rest, and hoped that Adam would keep his distance and would not distract her from her daydreams. Their services were held once every 4 weeks. The bishop lived in Reading, and every Sunday he traveled around to the smaller groups of worshippers. This Sunday there was no worship meeting. Adam drove to their home, and asked them to come to dinner the next night. There would be 2 other families there, the Williams and the Herschel family. Miriam's heart leapt with joy. She would see Stephen again the very next day. As Sunday was a day of rest, very little cooking was to be done. Miriam had to wait until the next morning to bake cakes to take to the special dinner. Miriam's family was the first family to arrive at the Stutzman's house for dinner. Before long the Herschel family arrived. They were a pleasant family of 7 children. The 2 eldest were boys and the remainder girls, ranging in age from 3 years old on up to 22. Miriam had to make a conscious effort not to stare outside, waiting for the Williams family to arrive. She heard someone say that Stephen was the only child in the family. At last they arrived in a black buggy pulled by a tall black shiny horse. The families gathered outside to greet them. Stephen's eyes met Miriam's, and she looked quickly at the ground, lest anyone notice them looking at each other. Having him in her presence was distracting, happily so. She felt whole again, she was confident and happy just having him near. Dinner had to be spread over 3 tables, there were so many people there. After a friendly meal, Adam's father said, I think it's time to ask a blessing on Adam and Miriam's union. Almost everyone murmured in agreement. Miriam felt her body freeze, she had to force herself to breathe. Stephen, being reminded that she was supposed to marry Adam, was the worst thing that could happen to her that night. Mr. Stutzman continued by bowing his head and saying a prayer asking God to bless their upcoming marriage. She did not want to be reminded of the fact she was to marry Adam, neither did she want Stephen to be reminded of it. Miriam closed her eyes, wishing she were elsewhere at that very moment. Why did their 2 families want them to marry so badly? Miriam was convinced that Adam had no fonder feelings for her than she had for him. The prayer was over, or at least Miriam no longer heard anyone speaking. She opened her eyes and looked at Stephen. Miriam's heart caught in her throat mid-beat. Was it so obvious? Could everyone see how happy Stephen made her? Did they all know the truth that she really loved Stephen and not Adam? Maybe that was why Adam's father had everyone there, to enforce the fact that she was to marry Adam. Her eyes darted around the room. She'd done her best over the past weeks to try to forget she was to marry Adam. She glanced at Adam from under her dark lashes, only to see that he was looking at her strangely, not warmly at all. Her gaze flickered to Stephen, who was looking at her too with sadness in his green eyes. Feeling she would be sick, she excused herself. She walked out of the house quickly and headed toward the stream, intending to splash some water on her face. Someone caught up to her, grabbed her elbow and tried to turn her around. She resisted. "I don't want to talk to you right now, Adam," she said without turning around. "It's not Adam, Miriam, it's Stephen." His voice was soft and comforting, his grip on her elbow steadying and reassuring, and he breathed her name softly. "Miriam, please, look at me." She turned and looked into his eyes, tears spilling onto her cheeks at the happiness she felt welling up in her heart at the sight of him. "It's okay, Miriam, I feel it too." "Don't cry, my sweet," he crooned. He stood an arm's length away, but it was too far. She wanted to be in his strong arms, with his beautiful hands comforting her and maybe even stroking her hair. But they couldn't be together that way. It wouldn't be right because she was promised to another. Just then she heard her mother calling her from the house. "I have to go, Stephen." "I'm sorry," she said. "We can't both be out here like this. They'll all think it odd." "I'm sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for, Miriam. This isn't your fault. Adam doesn't know what a prize he has, he doesn't deserve you. Meet me later? There's a mill down by the stream a quarter-mile up there." He pointed north of the creek. "Come to me just before the next daybreak. I have to see you again, alone." Miriam nodded before she hurried back up to the house. She ran to her mother, looking back once to see her handsome Stephen gazing after her, and wished she were running back towards him and not away from him. She was already counting the hours until dawn. Chapter 5. Blessed is the man that trusteth in the Lord, and whose hope the Lord is. Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 7. Just before daybreak, Miriam sat on the bank of the creek, waiting for the man she loved. The large willow tree above her nodded slowly, like it was restfully agreeing to anything happening around it. The moon spilled its silver glow over the creek, which gurgled gently below her. Miriam turned and watched the pronounced shadow heading towards her. Stephen's face was only a black shadow. As he drew closer, he was illuminated by the orange glow of the golden candle flame that flickered on the ground near Miriam. Stephen sat close to her, and in silence they listened to the soft babbles of the creek. "Thank you for coming." Miriam broke the silence, which had quickly grown unbearable for her. "You jesting? I should be the one thanking you. It really is a lovely place." "Well, sure it is, but it's even prettier in the daytime," he said. "Surely you have brought many young ladies here, it being so romantic and all." A coy smile lurked on Stephen's features, and he turned to face the water. Not that many at all." "I find that hard to believe." Miriam knew that she was flirting with the young man. "To tell the truth, you are the first lady I've brought here. I knew you would like it here." "I like it indeed. It's wonderful and so calm and peaceful." Stephen sniffed and looked out into the silvery water. After a short pause, he looked back at Miriam with a wild grin. "Calm it is all right. No one ever comes here. I'm a bit surprised myself that you agreed to come out here with me. You can't know for sure, you know, if I'm a gentleman or not." Miriam bit her lip. A quick shade of sadness ran through her body. "I never had any doubts about your gentlemanly behavior, Stephen. Not from the moment I first met you." Miriam felt the man's eyes on her, watching her intently. "And yet you might just be right. It was a mistake to come here with you, seeing that I am a woman of good character. Forgive me if I've said anything to make you think that I had ever considered otherwise. It's plain to see you do have good character. I didn't think anything else when I asked you to meet me here." Self-confidence disappeared from the handsome features of the young man. Miriam tried not to smile. He looked like a confused little boy. He was so different than the self-assured and smug Adam. "Stephen, the place is perfect. It's almost too perfect." She fell silent, and Stephen too remained quiet. "Stephen, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say this, but I'm to marry Adam, and that won't change." "I know that, Miriam, but it can be changed, can't it? Your parents will not make you go ahead with the wedding when they know how upset you are about it." "I'm sorry. This is so wrong. Miriam could not stop her tears as they flowed down her cheeks. He pulled her toward him with a strong arm around her shoulders. Everything will be okay, Miriam. You can't marry Adam though, you mustn't. Miriam was pleased to be close to him. She wanted more than anything to stop the marriage to Adam. She willed her tears to stop, sniffing a couple of times. I don't want to marry him. He wouldn't be good for you. He's a rough man, and he's looking for trouble all the time. I fear he will not respect you, Miriam. I know. It means a lot that you care for me, it really does. I don't want to marry him. I suppose I shouldn't keep saying that or admit that to anyone. Then just don't. Don't. It has to be you who wants the marriage. They can't force you. I know. I won't be with him, no, I can't live like this. She wiped away a tear and then another. Don't cry. Why do your parents want you to marry him anyway? I think they want me to be secure. They want all their children to be safe. We've gone through some hard times, very hard times. They think this would be the right thing to do, and I don't want to hurt their feelings, and I don't know how to tell them that I can't marry him. What a load of cow's dung, Stephen hissed. They want you to marry Adam, not to hurt their feelings, is that it? How about your feelings? Well, cry if you have to, I understand. But I want you to know two things. She blinked away tears and looked up into his eyes. She knew that he loved her and wanted her for himself. She wanted him too. Her betrothal to Adam was the only thing that stood in their way. Stephen continued, I'm glad you're not going to marry the man. You must find the strength to tell your parents. I want another chance to see you when you aren't crying. Miriam rested her head on Stephen's shoulder and watched the silver ripples on the surface of the water. Tears were still in her eyes, even though a little ray of happiness caused her lips to smile. Only the heavy knock of the wooden spoon was heard in the tiny kitchen. Mrs. Shantz was preparing a chicken stew. Dusk was already settling over the countryside, and Miriam's two older brothers and her father would be home soon. Miriam finished the cleaning and packing away the knives and boards they used for preparing the stew. She wondered how to tell her parents she didn't want to marry Adam in a way that they would take her words seriously. Nothing was on her mind, apart from her impending doom, which is what her upcoming marriage felt like to her. She sat quietly at the kitchen table, in order to be available if her mother had an instruction or task for her. I can't go through with this. Miriam's words had burst forth as if from deep within her chest. The timing was right, soon the others would arrive, and she'd have no opportunity for a quiet word with her mother like she had at that very moment. Her mother stared at her with her blue eyes flashing. Was it anger in her eyes or was it shock at her outburst? Miriam stared up at her mother. You can't make me marry Adam. Her mother tapped her spoon on the edge of the saucepan. When she stopped tapping, she shrugged. Would you let us all down, Miriam? You can't let us all down now that it's all been arranged. How about me being let down? Miriam lowered her voice. Adam is not nice to me, Mom. Why should I marry a man who shows me no kindness? I'm sure he will be nice to you if you give him a chance. He would not dare do otherwise. This is about our families. This is why you must come to terms with this. You really think the family interest will take care of everything? You think Adam will talk nicely to me and respect me because we share our lands and our labor, Mom? He can do whatever he pleases, and no one can say a word about it. When we're married, it will be too late to voice my opinion against him. It is now that I can have my say about him, for or against. I'm afraid it is against. I do not choose him. You should be grateful, you know you should. He's a solid-minded young man, and you will have a much more comfortable life with him, and we know him well and his family well. Comfortable? I'd rather starve and be happy, Miriam said, wondering if Stephen would be able to support the two of them. Her mother looked at her stony-faced. Miriam avoided her gaze and looked down at the wooden kitchen table. Her future would only be bright if she could make her mother and father see that marriage to Adam was a huge mistake. Adam is a good man, a great man, her mother said loudly. Good? I don't think he's ever said a kind word to me, ever. You barely speak to him. I don't think you've made any effort to get to know him. That is what pains me, Mom. I barely even know him. That's because he won't take the opportunity to speak to me when he can. Then when we do speak, he turns it into an argument or a joke. All I know is what people say about him." Miriam screwed up her nose. "People? People like Stephen Williams. Has he filled your head with all this nonsense?" "It doesn't matter. It's not about him, Mom. It's about you selling me like livestock to a boy who looks at me like I am property. I might as well be a piece of furniture, because he pays me all the attention that he'd give to a chair." Mrs. Shance's cheeks flushed red and she turned back to the stove. "God says that if you obey your parents, all will be well with you. Your father and I are in agreement that Adam will make you a good husband." "What does the bishop say then? What if I ask the bishop next time he visits and see what he says about you arranging this marriage for me?" "You'd involve the bishop just so you can have your own way, Miriam?" Miriam nodded. "Yeah, I would, because I do not love Adam, and the bishop would agree that I should choose my own man." Her father bounced into the kitchen. "Love will come, Miriam. No need to bother the bishop about it." Her two brothers followed their father into the kitchen with their heads hanging low, which gave Miriam to think that they'd heard the conversation with her mother. Either that or they were completely exhausted from their day's work. "Love will come," her father repeated. "That's how wonderful marriage is, how God has designed it." He patted Miriam on her shoulders and then walked over to his wife. "Now, I do hope dinner's ready. A pack of wolves has arrived, and they deserve a nice hot meal after a day so hard. Where are the girls?" "At the Stutzmans again, sewing quilts," Miriam said. "They'll be back soon." Chapter 6. He that loveth not knoweth not God. For God is love. 1 John chapter 4 verse 8. Miriam did not sleep a wink that night, or at least that's how she felt when a brisk new dawn lit the sky. Vivid scenes and imaginations had haunted her while she had cried quietly beneath her pillows. It wasn't easy sharing a room with her two sisters. The slightest sign that she was sad would set their tongues wagging. That night she'd imagined cruel things from Adam, and felt the terror as he threatened her and hit her, losing his temper because of a slight mistake. If they married, he might become irritated by her daydreaming. He might even be annoyed by something simple such as a sluggish movement, or for her not knowing how to cook his favorite food just as he liked it. Then she had comforted herself with soothing images of Stephen. Stephen was her protector, and one day she hoped their way would be clear so they could marry. He wasn't from their country, but his parents had joined with the community and their beliefs in God were now the same. It was important to Miriam to have a man whose heart was right in the sight of God. She knew she looked pale and bedraggled when she crawled out of bed with the first rays of sunlight. Miriam went to the kitchen and helped her mother prepare the hearty breakfast for her father and her two brothers, while her younger sisters slept in their beds. When her father and two brothers finally left the house, Miriam stood in front of her mother and uttered the words, "I would rather die than marry him." And then she left before her horrified mother could even catch her breath. She saddled their riding horse and headed to town, knowing that she should stay and help her mother with the chores. She'd be in trouble when she got back, but right now she needed to breathe. Miriam dismounted before she reached town, so no one would see that her dress rode up in an unladylike manner. With a loose hand on the reins, the gelding ambled along behind her. A quick wind settled dust on her shoulders, and she was sure that she could taste dust in her mouth. Once she reached the buildings, rough-looking men smirked and raised their hats as she passed by them. She could not decide if they were mocking her or offering their greetings. Two men outside a saloon said something to her, but she knew better than to turn back and look. She'd heard the adults talking at dinner, and knew that the local American people were wary of the large number of people moving into the area, some saying that the strangers were invading their land. She was angry with herself for not having the courage to go straight to the store where she knew she would find Stephen. Eyes followed her every move. She knew people were whispering about her being one of those people who were new to the county. The news was possibly out amongst their own Amish community that she was to wed the Stutzman boy. That meant she had to be careful when spending time in the company of other men to avoid gossip. A faint laugh or smiling eyes at another man could very well set tongues wagging and hurt the interests of her family. No doubt, news like that would reach the farm sooner than her feet could take her there. She wandered around the streets without any clear purpose. She tried to walk confidently to avoid attention, but she knew she looked lost, and that's how she felt. After drifting around for a while, she ended up at Stephen's family's store. She caught sight of him out back and gazed at him intently as he moved boxes in the yard. Luckily, he turned around a minute later. He stopped and looked at her. Miriam nodded toward the fields behind, letting him know that she wanted to speak to him. He gave a smile and a slight nod to let her know that he understood what she meant. No more than 10 minutes later, they were at the creek. They sat there in silence looking over the creek until, overwhelmed with emotion, tears fell down Miriam's cheeks. Stephen offered her his handkerchief and said, "You know, it's an old-fashioned thing, parents deciding who their children marry. We don't do that here in America. We don't do that in our old country either. I guess they aren't forcing me in that way. They strongly suggested I marry him, in a manner that I can't see that I can say no to it." Miriam sniffed and wiped her eyes. "Tell them that you refuse to marry him. Speak up or you'll be doomed to a life of misery." She looked at him through her veil of tears. "Do you think I should? Do you think I should refuse to marry him?" He nodded while staring at her with his green eyes, which caused her heart to flutter. She hoped that he would have said how he felt about her, even though she knew that he couldn't because she was officially engaged to be married. For that reason, he could not express his feelings openly. Miriam could tell how he felt about her, and that was enough. No words between them were needed. "Maybe you're right," she said, smiling as she looked over the top of the babbling water. "I should be allowed to follow my heart." She glanced across at Stephen to see him smiling back at her. Mrs. Shantz looked out the window, hoping to see Miriam. Every day she disappeared on their riding horse and was gone for a good 2 hours. It had been this way for weeks. She could only think that this was the way her daughter acted under the pressure of having to marry Adam. It hadn't escaped her attention that Miriam had lost weight and seemed paler every time she looked at her. Maybe marrying Adam was not in her best interests if it caused her ill health. Miriam's laughter was something she hadn't heard for a long time as well. She had convinced herself that Miriam would come to terms with marrying Adam, and she had hoped that her daughter would start to grow fond of him. Yet it was clear to everyone that Adam and Miriam were at odds with one another. Miriam was barely seen in the house when she didn't have chores. She spent as much time outside the house as she possibly could. If she even had a quarter of an hour to spare, she left with her hurried little steps. No one knew for sure where she went, but Mrs. Shantz hoped that she wasn't spending time with that Stephen boy. She'd heard a whisper that Miriam had been seen around the store where he worked more than once. Movement outside caused Mrs. Shantz to look out the window once more. Instead of Miriam returning, it was Mr. Shantz leading a horse. She went out to meet him. "What are you doing home so early?" "Horse has gone lame. Needs a day or two to rest, I'd say. I've come to fetch another." Mr. Shantz had always been a man of few words. Mrs. Shantz hoped she would be able to have a quick talk to him about Miriam while they were alone. "Where are the girls?" "Hazel and Moira are where they usually are, at the Stutzmans, helping Anna with the quilts. Miriam has gone for a walk." She was not going to tell her husband that Miriam regularly disappeared about this time of the day. Samuel Shantz looked around the field. "Where's the gray?" "I think Miriam might have taken him." He turned and looked at her with one bushy dark eyebrow raised. "You said she went for a walk." "She might have gone for a ride, I'm not sure." "You can't use the gray though, can you?" Samuel Shantz chuckled. "The gray is a riding horse. No good for field work." He turned the lame horse into the paddock and hit him on the rump. "I'll have a better look at this old boy when I get home. Could be just a stone bruise. Good thing we've got a spare." "Samuel, I want to speak with you about Miriam." Mary Shantz knew she'd have to speak fast because Samuel would want to be on his way. "Yeah, is she unwell?" "No, well, she has been looking poor. She's told me she does not want to marry Adam, and I fear that she is making herself ill over it. She feels strongly about not marrying him." "Is that why she's been quiet?" He scratched his dark beard. "I have noticed she's not been looking well. I thought she missed home." "We can't force her to marry Adam, Samuel." His shoulders stooped. "I won't watch my daughter fading away to her death. I'll talk to Adam and his parents and we'll sort things out." "How? I mean, what will we tell them?" she asked, gasping. "Marriage between the families is something I always hoped would happen, but it will only happen if it's God's will. Now we'll have to pray for rain and hope God wills for a good harvest. A humble smile on his lips caused zigzagged wrinkles to crease his cheeks. He continued, "We will be fine in this new land with God's hand upon us. He will watch over our children too. You know what's best for this family, Samuel. You always did know, and you do know now as well. And God Almighty knows how much I love you for that," Mary said, resting her hand on her husband's shoulder. Chapter 7. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. John chapter 15 verse 3. Miriam lay down the blanket on the fresh patch of grass, humming a happy hymn. All she could do was say a prayer of thanks when she'd been told that her parents had freed her from the duty of having to marry Adam. Even though she knew she couldn't be forced, it would have crushed her to go against her parents' wishes. She sat up and skillfully unpacked everything from her basket. The extra apple pie that she had baked and salvaged before her voracious brothers devoured it all, the cutlery, the new napkins she had sewn, and the remainder of the food. Stephen's quick footsteps were heard on the trail leading up to the tiny peak. Miriam had arrived way before the agreed time, so she could prepare everything before he got there. They always met in secret and tried never to be seen publicly. "You never mentioned a picnic," said Stephen with a big smile, waving a bunch of meadow flowers. "That is called a surprise. Now I would need to say you shouldn't have, but you know all too well how much I love flowers, so a humble thank you is all I have to offer." Miriam laughed as she took the wildflowers from him. "I've made this picnic to celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "You are very mysterious," he said while he joined her on the blanket. "I'm no longer expected to marry Adam. Stephen, I'm free. My parents told me last night. We are free and now we can be together." She had expected him to lift her up and wave her around or something, yet he was reserved. "What do you have to say? Aren't you pleased?" "I'm just baffled, Miriam. I'm happy for you. How did it happen? How did you get out of it?" "Well, it took weeks of hunger to force myself below a certain size that my mother finds terrifying, and putting white powder on my face before the break of dawn. I told my mother I was miserable. She must have listened to me this time." "That's good, I'm very happy for you. You didn't notice I'd lost weight?" "Yes, I did," he said. She quickly cut up and served an apple pie to the boy before she sank her teeth into another piece. With two older brothers, she was used to devouring her food quickly before it disappeared into male stomachs. She eyed Stephen as he sat there, finishing his piece of the pie. "I know that quizzical look on your face. You have something in mind. Don't you believe me? Or do you think my parents will go back on their word?" "I would not dare to think something like that. It must not be easy to deal with the Stutzmans, but if that's what they've agreed to, I guess that's good. That's a good thing for you. Life's just whimsical, as the poets and people as such say." He lay on his back, looking dreamily at the white clouds drifting above them, covering and uncovering the sun from time to time. Miriam twitched her nose. "When twists like this occur, we can't blame fate, we thank God. He has freed me from certain doom. But you have something else in mind, don't you? I see the cogwheel spinning behind your eyes." "You always see everything, Miriam. Nothing remains hidden from you." A quick frown lined Miriam's forehead as she detected slight annoyance in his voice. Chewing a small thread of weed, he seemed lost and reluctant to speak. Miriam sat silently, feeling her happy mood was now changing into something else. "Have you nothing to say then, Stephen?" Miriam tried to keep the irritation from her voice. Stephen sat up. "It's just that, I don't know how to say it, so I'm saying it like it is. I'm to wed a woman that I don't even know. She arrives here in 2 months. I'm sorry, Miriam, my father arranged it." A shiver ran through Miriam's body as he continued, "I'm afraid a little white powder just won't do the trick in my case. Only someone dying would be enough to go astray from my father's wishes." "You said that they don't do that in this country." "Not usually. No, it's true, but her family is wealthy and my father thought it a good match." She stood up as anger and frustration broke out of her. "You wasted my time. You fooled me." He jumped to his feet. "I never promised you anything. I never asked you to marry me or anything of the kind." Miriam covered her face with both hands. She'd been made a complete fool of. Was he seeing her out of friendship, only helping her accept her fate of marrying Adam. She had been sure that Stephen had loved her, and her betrothal to Adam had caused him to hold his tongue. Now she knew that there was no future with Stephen. She'd lost him even though she'd never had him. Life was whimsical indeed, but most of all it was cruel. Her throat froze and her body throbbed with pain. Stephen made a move to touch her shoulder, and she shied back from him. She took one corner of the blanket and proceeded to fold it, even though he was still standing on it. He stepped off it, and as soon as she folded it, she threw it in her bag, left the food on the ground and ran from him lest he see her tears. He ran behind her. "Miriam, I understand you being mad and all, I get it. I always thought I would gladly marry you, ever since we sat under the willow tree. I can't help this. It seemed your fate was sealed, and now when mine gets sealed yours changes. Maybe it had to be this way. We were never meant to be together like a decent couple." She didn't stop. Behind her she heard Stephen say, "If you want to see me you know what to do." He'd stopped following her and she was glad that he'd stopped. She looked quickly behind her, and when she couldn't see him, she sat on the ground and wept. Her salty tears ran down her face, and she stayed in that spot until the first chills of the evening wind arrived. Chapter 8. He delivereth me from mine enemies, yea, thou liftest me up above those that rise up against me. Thou hast delivered me from the violent man. Psalm chapter 18 verse 48. Try as she might, Miriam couldn't stop loving Stephen. Solitude was the only thing that kept her from going crazy. Whenever she could get away from her mother and the chores, she escaped to the comfort and familiarity of the deserted barn, which had been one of their many secret meeting places. For the moment, it was a place of blessed solitude. Standing in the barn, Miriam pawed desperately at her cheeks in a futile bid to wipe all the tears away. She leaned against one of the support beams and let her thoughts drift. She didn't know what to think. Her thoughts twisted over every single moment she'd shared with Stephen, every conversation, everything. She tried to puzzle out the clues that she should have seen before, but there were none to be found, which made her heart burn all the more. She tried to take a deep breath, but it couldn't quite get past the knot in her throat. Behind her, she could hear the rickety door of the old barn creak open. The footsteps in the straw and grit were familiar enough, but she didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. Miriam sniffled again and rubbed at her nose. "Miriam, I don't want to hear it right now, Stephen." She swallowed hard and shut her eyes. It didn't block out the sensation of his hand resting on her shoulder. She tensed under his touch and he withdrew. "I'm not in any mood to hear it. Please just go." "No. I won't. You need to hear it." Stephen's voice was thick with tears of his own. "I have deep feelings for you, but I can't go against my word. My father wants this marriage between Elsa and myself. I can't tell him that I have an eye for someone else." "And I could? It was perfectly fine for me to, but you can't?" She half turned to look at him, her bleary red eyes still watering. Yet her jaw was firm and her hands balled into fists. "That's awfully fair, isn't it? I can break my obligations, but you're helpless?" Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the shadow of his jaw as it clenched. "That's different. She's coming from very far away to marry me, very far. And I never asked you to cancel your betrothal. Not once. You chose to do that because you weren't happy. Now you're asking me to go against my word? I believe you encouraged me to stop the wedding. You told me to tell my parents I would not marry Adam. You told me they wouldn't force me to do it." She tensed further and turned away again. When he remained silent, she said, "When was all this arranged, your marriage?" Stephen didn't answer. Miriam could feel the tightness building in her chest again, and she buried her face in her hands. "I thought you were happy with me, with us." "I was, but I can't get out of it, I just can't. Not like you did. I value my word, and I already gave it when you were set to marry Adam." Miriam was furious that he held his word in such high esteem, after encouraging her to break her own word. "Why didn't you ever tell me about it? We saw each other every day." She swiveled to see the outline of his face in the darkness of the barn, and then turned away again. She could hear him breathe out heavily. "A part of me didn't want it to be true. I didn't want to marry someone I hadn't met." Miriam was silent for a long time while her shoulders shook with rage and sheer misery. She was surprised that she still had tears left, and she shed them without shame. When she spoke again, her words were clear. "I won't see you again, Stephen. Please go." She heard his boots scuff the ground as he walked away. He said from the door of the barn, "It's a small town and you know it. You'll have to see me again." She wasn't sure if she heard a twinge of sorrow in his voice or not. "Take care of yourself, Miriam Shantz." Miriam remained silent. All her tears had gone, and now she was angry rather than sad. She heard him say, "Please try to be happy. You are dear to me and always will be." Miriam did not reply, neither did she turn around. Her throat was too tight, and everything else felt so mixed up that words eluded her. She heard the barn door clang shut and she was engulfed in darkness. She looked up at the only light that streamed through a small upper window in the barn. A narrow shaft of light fell through the window and shone on the floor. The door shutting had stirred up dust which lighted, almost sparkled in the shaft. She stared at the swirling sparkles, freeing her mind of her sorrow-filled life. A thin breeze made its way under the barn door. Somewhere in the barn she heard a sound as if a rope smacked against a wall. At least, she thought, I won't be stuck in a terrible marriage with Adam. I suppose it could be worse. Yet she was through with crying. This was her life, and she had to make the most of things. She would not let sadness over a man ruin her life. Things were as they were, and it was clear now that Stephen was not going to be her husband, and she had to accept that. A pain waved across her tummy, and she nearly gave way to a fresh set of tears. She could have wept again, but she didn't. Instead she prayed, "God, I know you have a grand plan for my life. I don't know what it is, and I see now that I have tried to force things with Stephen, and that was a mistake. Thank you for freeing me from marrying Adam, and now I give myself to you. Please find me a good man to marry who I will be happy with, who I can bring children into the world with. Thank you, God, amen." Praying always comforted her. She dabbed at her still wet face with a handkerchief and sniffed a few times. Her heart still felt heavy, but she knew things would get better. Knowing her mother would be looking for her, she opened the barn door and headed home. That sourness and misery were still there when she got home. No sooner than she'd set foot in the house than her mother was there and fretting. "Are you well? You look under the weather." Miriam's throat tightened. "I'll be fine. I just need to rest, that's all." She tried on a smile that didn't quite fit, and her mother clicked her tongue. "If you need to talk to me about anything." "I know, Mother. I know." Miriam retreated to her room and sat at the edge of her bed, glad that she wasn't in trouble for disappearing again. After a time, she flopped onto her back and stared up at the ceiling, until the crushing weight of the world pushed her over the edge and into slumber. Chapter 9. O Lord, thou hast brought up my soul from the grave, thou hast kept me alive that I should not go down to the pit. Psalm chapter 30 verse 3. Miriam woke to the sound of someone knocking on her bedroom door. At first she didn't know what time it was, but looking out the window she saw the early afternoon sun low in the sky. She couldn't have been asleep for long. Miriam straightened herself up before calling, "Come in." The door opened. It was her mother. "You have a visitor waiting for you in the living room." "Oh." Hope swelled in her chest. She hoped it was Stephen, and that he'd told his father that he wouldn't marry that girl. Miriam bit her tongue against the urge to call out Stephen's name. She pinched her cheeks to give them color, smoothed down her apron and straightened her prayer cap. Walking into the living room, she saw Adam sitting on the couch next to her mother. Her mother stood up. "He wants to talk to you, that's all. I told him you wouldn't mind." Without waiting for a response, her mother scurried into the kitchen. "Thank you, Mother," she murmured through gritted teeth. She sat on the couch opposite Adam after nodding to him. "Hello, Miriam." "Hello, Adam." "I'm sorry for coming by this late," he began. "My parents told me you have cancelled our marriage." Adam pulled his mouth to one side, briefly looked at his feet, and then fixed his gaze steadily on her. "I want to know why." She had no idea she would have to face Adam and explain her actions. Wasn't this all settled and wrapped up? Miriam shifted uncomfortably and looked at her hands, which were laced together in her lap. She blew out a breath and kept looking at her hands as she said, "I don't think I can begin to tell you why. I really don't want to talk about it right now. Tomorrow." "No." Adam shook his head. "I want to know, Miriam. I need to know. This was something that was important to both of our families, and now you've changed things on a whim. I have a right to know why." She was too tired to cry, she'd shed too many tears that day already. She briefly buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook, but she fought back the sobs. Once she'd gained control of herself, she drew a deep breath and released it slowly. "Adam, you must know why. You weren't nice to me. You were dismissive of me. It seemed you thought of me as something to be dealt with rather than your future wife. I was shown no respect." She paused and finally looked up. She'd never spoken her mind to someone like that before. "You didn't make me feel as if you wanted to be around me. So as you can see, it was with no whim that I changed my mind." Adam's eyes widened and his mouth trembled at the corners. He said nothing and motioned for her to go on. She swallowed hard and continued, "And then there's the rest. I remember you being so sweet and kind when we were children. You were so nice. Do you remember you once called me your girl?" He lowered his eyes and nodded. "You are not the same Adam that I remember." Miriam trailed off, staring at him. Adam stood, took a couple of steps forward, only to descend to kneel on one knee. He reached for her hands, and she allowed them to be taken. "Miriam, he struggled with the words. "I didn't stop to think how you were feeling about all this marriage business. I just couldn't see past my own feelings. And those feelings were that I wanted to choose my own wife. Now that I've gotten to know you a little, I'd like to get to know you more." He stared into her eyes. "All I can do now is promise to be a better person from here on." He squeezed her hands and held her gaze with intensity. "Is that okay? Would that make you happier?" Miriam bit her lower lip and looked away for a moment. When she looked back at him, it was with a smile. "I would like that very much. It would make me happy, I think." He smiled back and gave her hands another squeeze. "My parents were a little upset when they learned that you wanted to cancel the engagement, but they understood. And now I understand too. You're a good woman and you deserve a good man." Her gaze dropped to their hands and her lips pouted in thought. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "It will be fine. I just have a lot on my mind." He nodded and released her hands. "Of course. If you're amenable to it, my family is having a large dinner in a week, and you and your family are welcome to join us." His smile tilted a little. "Though if you'd care to come out on a picnic with me tomorrow afternoon, or the day after, I would enjoy that." Miriam fought the smile that threatened, but only for a moment. "I think I might like that. Both things, I mean. Just feel free to call on me for the picnic when you'd like. I'll speak with Mother and Father about the dinner. I'm certain it will be all right." Adam stood up, smiling more vibrantly than before. "Good. I'm glad to hear it. I should go, but I just wanted to talk to you." He took a step toward the door and then turned. "I'm glad I did. Thank you for being so honest with me. I couldn't have asked for anything more. Goodbye, Adam." "Goodbye." He pulled the door shut in his wake, and Miriam flopped back onto the couch and stared at the ceiling. She sighed a long-suffering sigh, covering her face with her hands. "Oh, what are you doing?" she muttered to herself. Second thoughts swirled through her mind and she shut her eyes, as if that would block the worst of them out. She flung a cushion to the other side of the couch and stared into space while she thought about the past several hours. Was it a good idea for her to break off the marriage engagement to Adam in the first instance? Suddenly, she wasn't so sure. It seemed right at the time, and yet, if all she needed to do was talk to Adam and sort things out, hadn't she behaved in a rash manner? Suddenly, she wasn't sure what was right and what was wrong. The loud talking and cackling of her two sisters as they returned from the Stutzman's house broke her thoughts. They spent nearly every single day helping Anna Stutzman make quilts, after they tended to the morning chores. When dinner was done and her chores for the day were over, Miriam fell into bed exhausted. She slept deeply that night, filled by the twists and turns of her thoughts as they chased one another. Chapter 10. For his anger endureth but a moment, in his favor is life, weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Psalm chapter 30 verse 5. The picnic with Adam was one thing that Miriam found herself looking forward to, in a most unexpected way. She was surprised by the fluttering in her stomach, and the flush of excitement that coursed through her. Adam had been very different toward her when he'd visited. Gone was the brash, smirking, smart-mouthed Adam, and in his place was a kind, caring, and thoughtful Adam. It was the Adam that she'd remembered from years before. She wore her second finest dress and went out onto the porch to meet him. Adam arrived shortly before noon in his buggy. As he helped her into the buggy, he explained, "I felt that we should go for a ride as well. It's a fine day for it, and it would be nice to get away for a bit." Miriam grunted and settled herself onto the seat. "I can't disagree with that," she said. "Though I suppose I should ask just where we're going." "We're going to a wildflower field not far off from here. There's an old oak there, and I figured we could picnic under it." "Sounds lovely." She knew she was smiling, and she hadn't smiled for some time. He guided the horse off the dirt track, and then she saw the tree in the near distance. It was a tremendously large thing, jutting out in the middle of seemingly nowhere. They passed the remains of a broken stone wall, and he stopped the buggy when they were a few yards away. He helped her down and quickly saw to the horses, leaving her to care for the basket and blanket. The grass was vibrant green, and bright flowers of red, purple, yellow, and white stood out against the lush grass. She laid the blanket out in the shadow of the tree, and opened the basket to study the contents. Fruit, biscuits, ham, and some milk, and she thought she could even spot some kind of dessert wrapped up in there, but she didn't dare touch the parchment to find out just what it was. He joined her and sat across from her on the old battered blanket. She smiled and he smiled, and she could feel the familiar rush of second thoughts bubbling up. Those feelings continued to percolate while they talked, as much as she tried to will them away. It didn't even matter that they were talking about the mundane reality of their lives. They talked about their families and the upcoming dinner. They talked about the barn going up at the Eshes land. And then there was the weather to discuss, and the future harvest to debate, and all of it, every last bit of it, left Miriam entranced. Later, when he escorted her back to her house, she realized why. It was because they were talking without arguing. It wasn't something they'd ever done before, and it was strange to feel that a simple act of talking could thrill her so much. That night, Miriam stayed awake for some time, her thoughts mulling over their conversation time and time again as if something else might be found. The special dinner the Stutzmans had planned with the two families was enjoyable. It was nice to have their families together just as it had been in the old country. Though Adam had tried to make it seem like his family had only just considered inviting hers, it was clear that her parents and his had arranged the dinner for some days, maybe weeks. Though there was some tension at the beginning when Mr. Stutzman greeted her, the mood quickly turned festive, and it was plain to see that both families were still on good terms. Everyone was cheerful and good-humored, and even if there were a few odd looks shot her way, none of them held a sense of malice for breaking the engagement with Adam. It took Miriam some time to relax again in the Stutzmans family's company, but once she did, everything was better. The questions she dreaded never came, and she soon lost herself in the swirl of conversation and fine food that the family dinners were all about. Adam managed to pull her into a riddling circle of sorts, and she traded riddle for riddle with him and his brothers. She caught herself looking at Adam from time to time, and more thrilling, she caught him looking at her. When dinner finally wound down, her mother shooed her off to go home, while she and Miriam's sisters helped Adam's mother, Anna, clean up. Adam escorted Miriam home, and the conversation between them continued, casual and without a sense of expectation. The next weeks were more of the same. Adam's visits to the house were more frequent, and their conversation flowed. He was growing to be an important part of her life. The change in Adam was drastic. He was someone she would gladly marry if he stayed as he was and didn't return to his sullen, nitpicking behavior. Miriam had avoided Stephen over the past weeks. The few times she had gone to the store, she was thankful that he had not been there. Now her mother asked her to get some things from the store. She grimaced at the list her mother sent her with, and paused just outside the door of the store. She wanted to crumple the list up and throw it away, but there was a dire need for coffee and a handful of other things. Miriam pressed onward, walking inside and immediately turning down one of the aisles. The faster I get everything, she reasoned, the less likely I'll see him. She was doomed from the start. As she ventured into the section that held the soaps, she nearly bumped into him. Stephen raised an eyebrow and took a step back. "Miriam, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I just needed to get a few things," she blurted out, and then added, "for Mother." He opened his mouth to speak when the door jingled and someone else came in. Miriam half turned to see who it was, and felt a rush of relief when it was Adam of all people. Adam! There you are. Adam looked puzzled. Yeah, here I am. Were you looking for me? I was, she said, and took a few steps away from Stephen. She ignored the wounded expression on Stephen's face and turned her back on him. Adam, Mother wanted me to invite you and your family to our house for dinner this next week. That sounds wonderful. I know my mother enjoys cooking for those dinners, he said with a laugh. Is that what you're getting here, things for the dinner? No. Just some odds and ends for the house this time. She held up the list. Nothing urgent. He took the list gingerly and studied it before issuing a nod. I can wait for you and drive you back, rather than you wait for your father. I saw him at the postmaster's office, and he might be there for some time. Are you sure? Miriam blinked at him, knowing exactly how long her father would take, and it wouldn't have been long. Adam plucked the list from her hands. You wait in the buggy, and I'll be out in a moment. It won't take me long to gather these things. I have the money here. She pulled the money out of her bag. He waved her off. I said I'd get it, and I'll settle the payment. His serious demeanor didn't last, and his face cracked into a lopsided grin. Though if you take it and buy yourself a dress, I wouldn't fault you for it. I'd never do that, Miriam huffed. Should I wait here or? Adam shook his head. Wait in the buggy, as I said. This shouldn't take long. He stepped past a sour-faced Stephen while he launched into the list. Miriam snuck out and leaned against the outside wall of the store. Her stomach felt flip-floppy and she didn't care for it at all. She found her father at the postmaster's and told him she would travel back with Adam. By the time Adam came outside with the boxes, she felt slightly better. Once they were in the wagon, she asked, Did you get any of those hard candies? I have a few, he said, and leaned back to get into one of the boxes. A paper bag of the treats was held out and she picked out one that promised to be mint-flavored. It helped almost immediately and she relaxed. Thank you. My stomach's just been terrible all day. He offered a smile. I hope it feels better. I've heard something is going around. I hope it didn't get to you. I think I'll be okay, she assured him. After that, they fell into the same familiar and equally comfortable rhythm of conversation. It felt as though hardly any time had passed when they reached her house, and then he unloaded the goods. After he helped her inside with her shopping, he announced that he couldn't stay. They said goodbye and she stood on the porch and watched his wagon drive away. Chapter 11. Thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing, thou hast put off my sackcloth and girded me with gladness. Psalm chapter 30 verse 11. As the weeks turned into months, Miriam found it became easier to forget Stephen. When she had to go to the store, she would go with Adam or one of her brothers. Sometimes it was hard to ignore the look on Stephen's face. Most of the time she was able to distract herself with other thoughts. Sometimes she wondered if the woman he was meant to marry had arrived as she'd heard, but those thoughts were fleeting and she was happy to see them go. She braced herself for seeing the new woman at every believer's gathering, but there had been no sign of her. They were on their way back from the general store one day when Adam asked, Would you like to go with me to reading? I have some business to do there. It'd be nice to have company. He looked sidelong at her, and there was no mistaking the hope in his voice. Isn't that where the bishop lives? The bishop and a whole lot of other people. Miriam chewed her lower lip and looked away for a long moment, but she didn't need the time. She already knew her answer would be a resounding yes. Of course. I would love that. I will have to talk to my parents about it, but I don't think they'd mind. How long will we be there? Not more than a full day, maybe 2, he said. I can always bring you back if it's any longer, that I can promise you. I wouldn't want to keep you from your family or your chores for that long. He chuckled and she smiled. I'm sure my parents will be quite all right with that, and I think I'll be fine without chores to do for a day or 2. Excellent, Adam said with a smile. I'll pick you up tomorrow at dawn. At dawn the next morning, Adam's wagon stopped outside her house. Miriam took her place on the bench with her bag on her lap, and they were soon off at a comfortable clip. By the time they arrived in the next town, she was slightly less enthusiastic. The journey left her feeling grimy and worn out. Adam set off on his business, leaving Miriam to secure 2 separate rooms at one of the boarding houses. Miriam took her time to wash, taking advantage of the hot water and deep bath. When she was done, she changed into a fresh, clean dress. They would stay at the boarding house for 1 night, maybe 2. Miriam decided to go for a walk and see the town. She'd never seen another town in this new country, apart from the one in which she now lived, Earltown. As she was about to leave the building, the clerk behind the counter beckoned her over and handed her a folded slip of paper. When she opened her mouth to ask about it, the clerk shook his head and motioned for her to take it. Confused, Miriam took the note and read it. Then she read it again with a slight pinching of her brow and a tremble to her fingers. This can't be right, she thought. Why would he want to meet me here? How did he even know I was here at all? It didn't matter since the damage had been done. Maybe it was a gossipy sister who had told him, or it could have been her mother or even Adam's mother, Anna. She folded the note and sighed heavily. Thank you, she said to the clerk before she stepped outside. The note was clear. Stephen wanted to meet her in a field not far from the town. But for what? She wasn't sure. She bit her lower lip and shoved the note into her sleeve. Miriam headed for the field while her thoughts turned his words over and over again. Surely he just wants to apologize again. That other girl must have arrived by now. Maybe that's it, she thought. He just wants to talk about that. The very thought made her chest feel tight and she could feel her pulse pounding through her temples. Miriam took a few deep breaths to calm herself. As she approached the field, she saw just where he meant for them to meet. There was a makeshift lean-to that must have been meant for something but had long since fallen to disuse. He was there and waiting when she arrived. She firmly knotted her hands around the fullness of her dress. Miriam? You came. He faced her with a cautious smile. I was a little worried that you wouldn't. She looked expectantly at him but said nothing. His smile faltered. You don't look too pleased to see me. I shouldn't be here right now, she replied. You know that. I told you that I didn't want to see you ever again. And yet here you are. He smiled again. What do you want? Inwardly she winced at just how terse she was. Outwardly she kept her distance and watched him warily. He cleared his throat and dug a booted toe into the dirt. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have been so rude to you before. Stephen's mouth twisted to the side. She's not coming, the woman I was supposed to marry. Oh. Miriam raised an eyebrow. He looked away. It wasn't meant to be, and that's why God has prevented her from coming. Now we are free to be together. His eyes sought hers and found them, but only for a few seconds. Miriam looked away abruptly and shifted her weight. Her hands reknotted in her skirts and her shoulders tensed. I don't know what to say to that, Stephen, not now. Not after everything else you've said, everything else you've done. Nothing matters, just say that you'll marry me? Chapter 12. Blessed is that man that maketh the Lord his trust, and respecteth not the proud, nor such as turn aside to lies. Psalm chapter 40 verse 4. Miriam's fingertips flew to her mouth at Stephen finally asking her to marry him. Stephen continued, just say yes. I know I hurt you by saying I had to marry that girl, but I never stopped caring about you, and I think you'd suit me fine as a wife. Why are you doing this to me now? And as much as she wanted to tell him she loved him, her tongue refused to cooperate. Her throat felt tight and her tongue felt too thick and her eyes started to sting with frustration. He grimaced and looked at his feet for a moment before fixing his gaze on her again. Because I wanted to please my parents, but now I know better, you know better. Please, Miriam, just say the words and I'll be yours, and you'll be mine forever. As it should have been from the start. She couldn't speak. For though her heart still ached for Stephen, something else stayed her tongue. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground off to one side, and she listened to the pulse beat of blood in her temples. Was this what she wanted? It had been for the longest time. And yet the idea of answering him filled her with a strange sense of betrayal. She had feelings for him, yet those feelings were adulterated somewhat with the new feelings for Adam. Everything twisted up inside her, and it kept her tongue glued to the roof of her mouth while her throat worked hard to swallow past the lump that had developed there. At least let me finish, and then I'll let you go, and I promise I will never bother you again in my life. Fine, but make it fast, I mean it this time. You see, I was ready to take her as a wife even if my heart was still with you. I admit I was afraid of my father, and that's why I accepted a marriage I didn't want. She didn't come out here to this country because she said that we wouldn't be compatible financially. I don't have a big fortune, I'm not rich, and she is looking for a man who is. Why is she so concerned with money? Isn't she one of God's people? He nodded. Dad said that she and her family are believers. At first I couldn't believe what I had heard, but then I had to laugh. What? She didn't come here because you weren't rich? What kind of reason is this? Miriam had no idea about women's claims when marrying, financially speaking, because her parents were poor and had fought to build things from nothing. It could be proper that some women expect things if they're to be married to a man they don't know. Maybe, Miriam reasoned, it was sensible of that woman to protect herself from an uncertain future. How selfish was that woman? I don't want to be with a woman like that, Stephen said. What did your father say about her not coming here? Well, he replied, as serious as he could be. That is why we told everyone that I refused her, because I didn't want to make him look like a fool, or make me look like a fool. Miriam bit her lip. Honesty was important to her, and this man was showing that he was more concerned of what people thought of him than being honest in God's sight. Is that all you wanted to tell me? There was no point in her spending more time with him now she had seen his true character. Yes. I do hope you will find forgiveness for me one day, even if you don't want to look at me like you used to, he replied. I forgive you, of course I do. But we can't be married or be anything else, we can't be friends as we once were. He curled his lip and snarled at her. You're just spoiled. Do you think that Adam is going to marry you now that you rejected him? His eyes narrowed. His parents have lined up another woman for him to marry. Miriam's jaw dropped. She was sure that Adam had grown deeply fond of her. Who? Miriam placed her hands on her hips. Stephen Williams, you tell me who they have for Adam to marry? She eyed him carefully, wondering if it were another of his stories. He tossed his head back and laughed a cruel laugh. Why, you stupid fool, it's your very own sister, Hazel. Miriam covered her mouth with her hand. Hazel and Moira spent most days at the Stutzman's house quilting. Hazel had plenty of opportunity to get to know Adam, and he to know her. Feeling suddenly queasy, her hand went to her stomach. At first she didn't believe his words, and then it all fell into place. Adam had said he liked blondes that very first day. She thought he was smart-mouthed or cruel, but what if he'd meant it? Maybe Adam had designed this trip to get her blessing for her younger sister and him to be together. Traditionally, the older sister would be the one to marry first. She looked at Stephen to see him smirking at her. You're lying, she said, hoping she was right. He put his head to one side. Am I? You'll soon find out. With that he walked away and left her there. Now with an instant headache, Miriam collapsed onto the grass. I can't believe it. I should have just gone ahead and married Adam when I had the chance. By going against her parents' wishes, she'd lost Adam. She sat on the grass and spread her dress over her legs as she always did when she sat. How had her life become so complicated? She was an innocent girl who thought her life would play out in an easy fashion. She'd fall in love, get married, and have many children. Her days would be filled with baking, laughing with her children and her man by her side. Miriam had believed in love, and would have given up everything to be with that one man. Surely there could be only one man in her life she could love like that, just one man to give her heart to. She'd thought that man was Stephen, but he'd shown that he wasn't a man of strong principles. Having him so firmly planted in her mind as being the one for her, she hadn't questioned or taken much notice of the things that he'd said. If she had, she would have noticed that with all his encouraging her to stop the wedding to Adam, that he hadn't actually said that he would marry her. Thinking back now, Miriam recalled there were no words of commitment from Stephen or of a future with her as his wife. Only now Stephen spoke of marriage after he'd already shown he was deceitful. Miriam looked up at the few clouds and wondered if it were all a game to Stephen. He'd known all along that she was supposed to marry Adam. What a fool she'd been to assume that Stephen had wanted her as his wife, and all along he was set to marry someone else. She'd been Stephen's second choice for a bride. He wasn't man enough to stand up to his father, even though he'd encouraged her to stand up to hers. After Stephen had disappeared from her sight, she stood up, straightened her clothing, and set back to town. When she arrived in the main street, she saw Adam standing by the wagon. On closer look, his mouth was downturned. "What's wrong, Adam?" she asked when she reached him. "I saw Stephen in town. The man is fond of you, and I don't like him near you." Miriam nodded, and wondered if he'd have such a strong response if he were fonder of Hazel than her. "I've seen him. He asked to speak to me in private. I've only just come from talking to him." Adam straightened up and his eyes blazed with fury. "You did? I mean, he asked you to speak to him and you went?" "Yeah. I don't know how he knew that I was here. Don't be so cross with me." He frowned and his shoulders tensed. "You should have left him well alone. What did he have to say?" She looked down at her feet, then back up into his face to see his jaw was clenched. "He wants to marry me." Miriam spoke quickly, knowing Adam would be angry. Adam grunted loudly and through gritted teeth said, "He's marrying someone else from what I've heard. She isn't coming here anymore. I don't know why." "I hope you didn't say yes, did you?" "No, of course not. I don't want to marry Stephen." She studied Adam's face. He seemed relieved, but that had been a perfect time for him to state his intentions toward her, and yet he didn't. Was he holding a secret about Hazel and waiting for the right time to tell her? It would only be natural for a man such as he to be attracted to her younger sister. She was a happy girl with pretty blue eyes and light hair. "Let's try to forget about Stephen while we're here. We'll go and have a nice meal." He nodded his head toward a restaurant. "We can get something to eat in there." Chapter 13. Let all those that seek thee rejoice and be glad in thee. Let such as love thy salvation say continually, "The Lord be magnified." Psalm chapter 40 verse 16. Adam and Miriam sat looking at each other across the table. It was as though neither could find the right words. Stephen had ruined their trip, but if what Stephen had said about Hazel were true, Miriam would rather find out now. "Adam, Stephen told me something, and I don't know if it's true." Adam gave a chuckle. "If Stephen told you something, I'd guess it's not true." He looked intently into her eyes. "That was awful of me to say such a thing, but he's not shown he can be trusted in certain things." He cleared his throat and looked down at the chicken pie in front of him. Could he have known that Stephen had broken her heart? Knowing that no good comes from not talking about things, Miriam swallowed hard and said what was on her mind. "Stephen also told me that you're to marry Hazel." Adam looked up at her, open-mouthed. "What? Hazel, your sister Hazel?" Miriam nodded. "Why that?" Adam bounded to his feet, upending the chair he'd been sitting on. "Where is he?" His nostrils flared and his face turned a deep shade of scarlet. Everyone in the dining area turned to look at him. "Sit down, please," Miriam said. Adam picked up the chair and then moved to sit right next to her, ignoring the fact that all eyes were on them. "Miriam, you don't believe it, do you? He's lost his mind. Hazel is like my own sister and way too young for a man like me." He made an attempt to laugh, but it sounded more like a growl. Miriam shrugged. "Only 2 years younger than me." Adam opened his mouth to speak, but Miriam rested a hand on his. "I didn't believe him, but I needed to hear it from you. Since I came to this country, nothing has been how I thought it would be. I've had so many shocks and disappointments, and I hoped that this wasn't another." Adam put his other hand over hers. "Miriam, I am only interested in you. I need you to know that." "You are?" Finally, she felt she was able to relax. He did like her, and he as good as said so. "I thought you might figure it out since I asked you here, and with all the time we've spent together." He laughed. "It's funny when you think about it. He's in love with you." "Stephen?" He frowned at her. "Yeah, Stephen, he's in love with you. Why else would he follow us here, meet with you in private, and tell you a ridiculous story about me and your younger sister? You did say that you like blondes, and that was on the very day I came to your house. We hadn't seen each other for years, and that was all you could say to me." He gently placed her hand on the table and put his hands down by his sides. Moving back slightly, he said, "I know that's what I said, and I told you my reasons for saying that. When you first arrived, I behaved badly, but I can't change the past." He shook his head and his jaw stiffened. I thought we'd agreed to leave our past behind us. Miriam nodded enthusiastically. I agree we should keep the past behind us, but it gave me reason to think that there might be truth in what Stephen said. Adam breathed out heavily. Well, if you'd cared to ask, my business here went well, and there's no need for us to stay here any longer. I suggest we make our way back before nightfall. Really? I thought we were going to make a time of it, just the two of us. He stood up. So did I up until now. He leaned down and spoke quietly. I'll settle up for this meal. Then I'll go and fetch my belongings from the boarding house. When you finish the meal, I'll meet you at the wagon. Miriam was left alone at the table, halfway through her chicken pie. She'd made him angry by bringing up the past when they'd already talked about their issues and apologies had been given. She wondered if she shouldn't have mentioned Stephen at all. Her appetite was gone. She waited until he'd left the building, and then she made her way to the boarding house to quickly pack her things. Just as Miriam stepped out of the building, she saw Stephen approaching her. What are you doing? Are you following us, Stephen? He placed his hands low on his hips. I guess the bishop might like to know that you two are here alone, or perhaps your father? My father knows already, and he also knows that neither of us would do anything that we weren't supposed to. I found out that you were lying about Hazel. Just as I suspected you were. Was I? And who told you I was lying? Adam? He laughed an evil laugh. Anyway, why are you watching us and following us? I'm the only man for you. I don't know why you can't see that. I think that Adam wants both sisters. 2 for the price of 1. Don't be ridiculous. Miriam went to step past him, and then he grabbed her arm roughly. Let me go. Kiss me. He leaned toward her with his lips puckered. Are you ready to go, Miriam? Adam asked. Stephen released her immediately at the sound of Adam's voice. Miriam looked to her side and saw Adam. Stephen stepped back from her. Yes, Adam. She took a large step away from Stephen. I just need to collect my things and I'll be right down. Miriam hurried away from the two men, her head in a muddle. She looked back over her shoulder, expecting that Stephen having a hold on her would have enraged Adam. Adam had ignored him and walked away. Not long ago she thought she loved Stephen, but now he was behaving so differently from the man she thought she'd loved. She no longer could see herself with a man such as Stephen. Stephen's appearance in this town had ruined things with Adam. If Stephen hadn't shown up, she and Adam wouldn't have had an argument. Miriam hoped that Adam didn't think there was something going on between her and Stephen. As fast as she could, Miriam climbed the stairs of the boarding house and quickly pushed everything into her small bag. She took a moment to catch her breath and sat on the bed. Maybe God was showing her that none of these men were suitable for her. Perhaps God had another man somewhere that was more suitable. She didn't want much, just to have someone to show her kindness and love. She walked to the window and looked down at the road. She saw Adam waiting in the wagon for her, but she didn't see Stephen anywhere. She swung her bag over shoulder and headed out to the wagon. The drive home was mostly spent in darkness. Miriam was scared and cold. It was silly to set off on such a long journey so late in the day. She was angry with Adam for being so sensitive and letting their little spat get the better of him. She was also angry with Stephen for showing up and telling her ridiculous lies. Then she could take the silence no longer. Aren't you going to say anything? Are we to spend this whole trip in silence? She waited for him to speak, but when he didn't, she said, I think you have nothing to say. You had plenty to say to me yesterday. What has changed? I'm still the same person. Miriam, I had an idea that you were fond of Stephen, but I thought you'd gotten over that. He glanced sideways at her. She looked away from him and kept quiet. I don't have time for games. Games are for children, and I am no longer a child. Neither am I a patient man. Stephen would have followed us here if he thought you still liked him, if he thought he still had a chance with you. Does he? Does he what? Miriam snapped back. Adam sighed loudly. Miriam grew annoyed with Adam questioning her. If you are such an adult, why didn't you listen to me properly? You sulked like a child when we were eating. So maybe you are a child because that's how you're acting. Wouldn't a grown man be more careful than to set off on a journey in the dark? Or is that a sign of someone who let their anger get the better of them? She folded her arms tightly across her. Miriam knew she had a very good point, and wondered how he was going to answer. He was silent for the longest time, and it was about another 10 minutes before he said anything. "You're right, Miriam, I did act in a childish manner. I was angry to learn Stephen must have followed us and you'd spoken to him, and angry that he told you those lies about Hazel. If I were more sensible, I would have set off for home in the morning rather than leave late in the day. It would have given the horses more time to rest as well. I'm sorry our time together was ruined." "So am I. I was upset in the restaurant because you won't let the past go. I apologized for the way I treated you when you first got here. Am I to apologize to you every day? It's getting tiresome. I thought I had forgiven and forgotten, but then when I saw how you reacted when I asked you about Hazel, it was the old Adam back. Not the Adam that I'd gotten to know these past months. How do I know which one is the real Adam? One day you are nice, and the next day you find something that upsets you and you bark at me like an angry dog. Miriam, you're turning this into something that's all about you. What about me and my feelings? Are you so absorbed with yourself and who you're going to love, and who is going to love you, that you don't see what's important? Are you saying I'm selfish, Adam Stutzman? Yeah, I think that's it, sometimes you are. I went to Reading to do some business, and you know I was doing business there, and when I got back you did not ask me how it went. It was all about you and all about Stephen and what he'd said. Then you questioned my feelings for you and my loyalty to you." Miriam was too tired to argue. She gazed up at the moon and gave some thought to what he just said. She was thankful the moon was so bright and grateful that home was now not far. "You're right, I should have asked you how everything went for you. Maybe I have been a selfish girl, only concerned with myself. I never realized that before. How did everything go for you with your business?" "It doesn't matter now. Forgive me, Miriam, it's me who's in the wrong. I got too upset when I heard what Stephen said about me, and then I hoped that you didn't have feelings for him. Maybe we're both in the wrong." Miriam giggled, not because she thought anything was funny, but because she wanted to lighten the atmosphere between them. "That doesn't answer my question though, Miriam. Do you have feelings for him?" Chapter 14. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Selah. Psalm chapter 3 verse 4. Miriam hadn't expected him to ask about her feelings for Stephen. A part of her still had feelings for him, but she didn't want Adam to know that about her, but she couldn't lie. "I did like him once. I was fond of him before I really got to know him." So the rumors were right then? "What rumors?" "The ones about you two sneaking around when you were betrothed to me." She took a deep breath. Things were getting worse, his questions were cornering her. "I had no choice in being forced to marry you." "Forced? No one can force you to marry someone. You said yourself that you were obligated to marry me and that you had felt trapped. We shouldn't be talking about this now. We're both tired and it's late. We'll get into a huge argument and I don't want that. Let's remain silent and talk another day. We're nearly home." The remainder of the journey was spent in silence. When he pulled up outside Miriam's house, she was glad that all the lights were off. She crept into her bedroom, slipped between the covers, and went to sleep without giving a second thought to either Adam or Stephen. Miriam woke the next morning to both her sisters bouncing on her bed. She opened one eye to see the girls looking at her. "What happened?" "I thought you wouldn't be back until tomorrow," Hazel asked. Miriam yawned. "Plans change. Let me have some more sleep. Tell Mom I'm having a couple of hours more in bed, and then I'll get up. Okay?" The girls left her alone. When Miriam finally woke, she was glad that her mother didn't ask any questions about her quick trip. Her mother must have guessed that all did not go well, since she had returned earlier than expected. Miriam half expected that Adam would come to her house and straighten things out between the two of them, but there was no sign of him all that day. The very next day, Miriam's oldest brother James asked her to go into town with him and gave her the usual grocery list. She hoped she wouldn't see Stephen at the store since he wasn't always there. There was also a chance that he was still in Reading. James stopped the buggy directly outside the store, and went to do the few errands that his father usually did. Miriam was left to shop at the store. She took a deep breath and walked inside. Stephen stood just to the left of her. She jumped when she saw him. She kept her head down and marched down the first aisle. He sidled up to her. "Come on, can we quit playing?" "I don't know what you mean, Stephen," she said without looking up at him. "What were you doing with him again? Don't you remember what he did to you the first time, or are you women not able to resist a badly behaved man? I guess you deserve everything you'll get if you think you'll be happier with him." It was all too much for Miriam. She crumpled the list in her fist and ran out of the store. When she was in the street, she heard someone call her name. "Miriam." She looked to see Adam. He looked from her to the storefront. "Has Stephen said something to upset you?" "No, I'm fine. Don't trouble yourself for nothing. Besides, it's none of your concern. From what I understand, he dumped you when he thought he was marrying someone else. Then he changed his mind about her and then wanted you back. There's something wrong with him." "Well, the thing is, he didn't let that girl go. She never got here for some reason. And then he came back to you, but by then we were getting along fine. Am I right so far?" Miriam looked down at the ground and sniffed. His gaze dropped to the crumpled shopping list still in her hand. "Are those things you need to get from the store?" She whimpered, "Yeah." "Give me your list." He held out his hand. Miriam uncrumpled her list and handed it to him, along with the money James had given her for the items. "I'll be back soon. Don't go anywhere." Miriam sat in the sun outside the store, waiting for Adam while James was at the post office and running other errands. When Adam came out, he loaded the shopping onto her father's wagon. He looked around. "Where is your father?" "He's not here today. I came with James. He'll be back soon. Thank you for doing this for me." "Will you allow me to call on you this afternoon?" Adam asked. He smiled so nicely that Miriam's heart fluttered. She nodded, pleased that he was still interested in her after their horrid words with each other. Adam waited with her for a few minutes until James arrived. Once James and Miriam were on their way back home, James said, "I'm glad to see you getting along so well with Adam." Miriam looked across at James to see a glint in his eye. "Yeah, we are getting on better. He's calling on me this afternoon." James nodded. "Good. I'll be happy to see you marry a man like Adam, or perhaps Adam himself." James chortled. "I haven't met many men that I'd be happy for my sisters to marry except the Stutzman boys, and maybe the Herschel boys." "You really think Adam would be good for me?" "I do. He has a good heart and he's kind. He will make you a good husband." This approval from her older brother meant everything to her, especially since James was the brother with whom she had a special bond. He was the one who had always been protective of her, and if James approved of Adam, that was a good recommendation indeed. She knew full well that he did not think that Stephen would make a good husband, even though his family belonged to the same community of worshippers. After Miriam packed the food in the storeroom, she raced into her bedroom to get dressed. First she washed her face and then brushed out her long hair. She carefully rebraided her hair and fixed it on her head, placing her prayer cap over the top. Her dark green dress was the one she chose to wear, and then she dotted perfumed oil behind her ears and on her neck. Adam was the man she liked, although he was not always easy to get along with. Miriam wasn't sure whether it was she or he who was at fault when they had cross words with one another. That afternoon, Adam called for her in his black open-topped buggy, which only needed one horse to pull. "You look nice," he said when she stepped onto the porch. "Is that a new dress?" "It is. My mother made it for me." He helped her into the buggy and they set off up the road. Once they had gone a little distance from the house, he stopped. He tied the reins to a fence and then offered her his hand to help her step down from the buggy. She placed her hand in his and stepped down. He kept hold of her hand as he walked. Miriam was pleased they were hand in hand and quickened her steps to keep pace with his long strides. "I know we didn't get off to the best start. We've had our share of arguments." Miriam hoped that his words were leading to a good place. She could not take one more disappointment. He stopped and faced her, still holding her hand. He looked down and reached for her other hand, and he held them both. Miriam, what I'm trying to say in my own foolish and maybe strange way is, will you be my wife again for certain this time? Miriam took a sharp breath. Really? Really? I'd like you by my side for the rest of my days. He smiled. I don't want to argue with anyone else but you. I want us to marry and have many children. What do you say, Miriam? With tears brimming in her eyes, she could only nod because she didn't know if she could speak. She then squeaked out, "Yeah, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms. That makes me so happy. Come, let me show you something. Keeping hold of one hand, he led her up a path. Now with an arm around her waist, he pointed out to the fields and said, "This is soon to be my land, no, our land. Our house will be here, right where we're standing." Miriam opened her mouth in shock and looked about her. We will live here? It was close to both families. Yeah, I will make you a fine house, a large one, and we can sit here on our large porch, and we can sit and overlook our land. He leaned in close and whispered, "That's what I was doing in Reading. I was securing this land, it will be ours soon." Wonderful, everything is just wonderful. Only thing is, he said, holding her a little tighter. What? She looked up at him. I won't have you going into town. I'll have to be the one to go to the store as long as Stephen is around. Don't be ridiculous, once we're married he won't have words with me. Adam went red in the cheeks. Miriam, I love you with all my heart, but the man say is the man say. Miriam put her hand over her mouth and laughed. We're having another argument. He laughed too. We are. He pulled her closer and tilted his head until it rested on the top of hers. They both gazed at the land, and then Adam said, "Whatever our life will be, I dare say it will be lively. I wouldn't have it any other way." Looking across the land, Miriam was pleased that God had listened to her prayers. She'd come all this way for a new and better life, and that is what she had now. She had a man who loved her, and he'd proved that he was a good man. We will have many children, and they and their children will thrive in this land for generations. A chill of wonder rippled down Miriam's spine as Adam spoke his words. She could nearly sense their future offspring present and working the land. Don't change your mind about me this time, Miriam. Miriam giggled. I won't. I couldn't be without you now that I've fallen in love with you. He kissed her lightly on her forehead. Now come, let's tell our parents the good news, they'll be overjoyed. No, let's just stand here a little longer. I want to remember this moment forever. Miriam tried to commit all that she saw and everything she felt to memory. She would remember this time when she was old and gray. This moment was the happiest in her life. Thank you for reading Arranged Marriage. The next novella in the Amish Brides series is Book 2, Falling in Love.